Bill Schmidt. Welcome to 30 Minutes.
In my last segment, we talked about income inequality in the United States, and this is part 2. And if you've missed the first part, don't fret. You can go to GNAT's website, GNAT's website, go to video on demand, and you'll see it there, and just click on it. So no problem there. But I'd like to summarize a bit about what I said last time. Income inequality in the United States, which I've termed the incredible shrinking middle class, is a very, very serious issue, although you don't hear very much about it from the politicians. Certain people, including the chairwoman of the Federal Reserve, has voiced her concerns about this issue, and really they have a point. I mean, I said last time that the way to best compare income inequality in the United States is to compare it to other countries. And there is an index called the Gini, G-I-N-I, the Gini index, that was developed to do just that. And what you'll find is that the United States comes in dead last as far as developed countries go in income inequality. That's right, dead last. We're at 38, where the Gini index goes from 0, meaning 0, everyone gets the same wealth and income, to 1, where only one person in the country, whatever country, gets all the wealth. So the higher the number you have, the more income inequality that you suffer. The United States is 0.38. That's 6 points larger than the last developed nation. Countries like Chile and Mexico and Turkey have more income equality than we do here at home. The problem is that this accelerating income inequality in the United States could have some dramatic effects on not only the economy, but in our social classes and what will happen in the future. This country's income inequality has gotten to such proportions that it's almost like what you saw in, say, the 20s, okay? Which brings in mind the 20s and the 30s. And I'm kind of study that era of the country. And I see a lot of similarities over the last couple of years in the United States to what happened in the 30s. For example, if you recall, we had the stock market crash in 1929. We had a stock market crash in this country, the second big one in 2008 and 2009. We didn't go into a Great Depression. I think that's thanks to the Federal Reserve, but we are in the Great Recession. And what's happening is that even though the stock market is going to great heights, the unemployment rate has been very, very sticky. And even saying that now that the unemployment rate is under 6%, most of us out there don't feel as if we're taking part in this recovery. And I believe this has a lot to do with income inequality. For example, the top 5 or 10% of income earners in this country had a whopping 275% or more increase in the last 30 years in their income, versus a 33% gain in the lowest 20%. These are the kinds of numbers and things that used to happen or were happening in the 30s during the Great Depression. So, if you recall, worldwide, at that time, you had an enormous amount of political, social, and economic upheaval. You had the rise of communism, you had socialism, you had Nazism, okay? You had World War II. Basically, it culminated in World War II. And you had, during the U.S. Depression, you had a widening income inequality like you have today. And even in the United States, you had sporadic riots, labor battles, vigilantism, things like that. Actually, at that time, the United States was worried that, in fact, if the income inequality, if the Depression continued, that maybe this country would fall to socialism or communism or even to the Nazis. So if you recall, Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time had many worries about this happening, okay? And he and Congress basically, in some respects, in order to head off increasing income inequality and a possible revolution of some sort in this country, started coming up with programs to redistribute some of the wealth. And they did that through programs like Social Security and the New Deal. And there is some argument that some of this jump-started the economy, although I believe what really happened was World War II happened, and that government spending had to go towards the war effort, and that government spending based on building battleships and planes and everything, which is what actually got this country out of the Great Depression, or at least I believe that's what happened. So, why the history lesson? Am I advocating that in order to solve the income inequality in this country, we need another New Deal? Redistribution of wealth. My God, is this a dirty word? I won't be political, but for the most part, whenever any politician raises the issue of redistribution, the opposition immediately starts calling them socialist or communist, even though there is no socialism or communism as we used to know it today in this world. Then you have the people that argue that Reaganomics was the problem, that President Ronald Reagan's theory, political and economic theory, that if you grew the economy strong enough and well enough, that money would trickle down somehow to you and I in the middle class or to the lower poverty line classes. Well, after 30 years, trickle down doesn't seem to be working, okay? So in the face of contrary evidence, there's a big hole in exactly what do we do about this, if anything, okay? What my argument is that we should look at my favorite saying, which is, what we don't know, we don't know. What? What I mean by that is what we don't know is that 21st century capitalism is not your daddy's capitalism. Now, in every political campaign, people talk about free markets, laissez-faire economy, capitalism. They talk about this almost as if those economic concepts are equal to democracy. But democracy is a social and a political idea, whereas capitalism and free markets, if we ever had them, is an economic ideal. But in this country, in our hearts and in our minds, the two are somehow equal. What we don't know is that they're not equal. You can have democracy without capitalism. Okay, it's okay to say that. And I'm certainly not advocating the end of capitalism by any means. I am a capitalist. I just would like to see a different kind of capitalism, not a 21st century capitalism. You see, the problem is that no matter what we do here in the United States about income inequality in and of itself is going to continue to grow worldwide. Why? I went through this in my last segment. It's the way capitalism has grown up, okay, throughout these last 30 years. It's about global competition and what big corporations need to do in order to compete overseas. And that is they need to be bigger and bigger, and they need government help. They need tax breaks. They need low-cost loans in order to compete with the low-cost loans and the tax breaks that the corporations in China or India or Germany are getting from their governments. So the idea of a free market system doesn't work in 21st century global capitalism. And yet, myth of myths, every time the elections come by, we're talking about capitalism and free markets as if nothing has changed in 30 years. Ask yourself this. Do you really believe that the communism has changed in the last 30 years? Of course it has. Look at mainland China. You've got basically a communist political system and what they call a free market capitalistic system. Not quite. Not quite. And just as not quite, you don't have a free market in the United States. You haven't had one, as I said, since your daddy's years, and before that. Now, what was capitalism of yesteryears? Well, capitalism had accountability. It had rules of law. It was fair and competitive markets. Compensation was appropriate to social value created. When was the last time you got a raise? Yeah. Equal access to capital. Are there any business owners out there? Raise your hand. Okay. Can you get a loan at the bank? I won't mention any of those big conglomerates, but any of the Fortune 500 companies can go to any bank in the United States and get a loan at a very, very low cost of interest. Can you? Of course you can. You go to your local bank, and the only corporations and companies, small companies and people who can get a loan at a bank is those who don't need to borrow the money. Okay, that's what the reality is today in our country. Okay, financial markets function as a source of lending and capital. The stock market. Do you really believe the stock market is functioning as a source of lending and capital? Back there in my daddy's age, a company that would go public in the market, and that's how they would find their funding along with the banking. Today, the majority of Wall Street is shuffling money from here to there to back to here, okay? It's speculation, and we all know that. Today, in our 21st century capitalism, what have we found? Well, we found a decline in domestic competition. Every day you turn around, there's somebody else buying somebody else. The merger and acquisitions are run rapid, and bigger is better, largely because of what I said, because of global capitalism. And as I said, bigger is better, and it's gotten to the point that it's too big to fail. And many of our financial banks, for example, fall into that category. We have, as I said, a selected access to capital. Okay, depends on who you are that gets that loan. The laws and regulations are drafted to enhance our major corporations' competitive position overseas and to preserve the status quo at home. That's what basically has happened. And as you know, there's now elements of crony capitalism, okay? What does that mean? We all know that there is a financial, if not theoretically political, leaning between our corporations and our politicians and back and forth. In other words, were you surprised that the last 2 or 3 politicians that left Congress or the Senate showed up on Wall Street or in a large corporation within weeks? And this is a two-way avenue, okay? It's almost as if you spend some time in the corporate sector, you do your favors, yada, 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 then you're hired by a Wall Street firm, an investment banking firm, a large corporation for a couple of years, and then you're back in government, okay? I call that crony capitalism, and that's rampant, okay? So, as a result of that, do we really have the opportunity that our dads and moms and grandparents had today under capitalism? Do we really have the opportunity, the social and economic and political opportunity to move up in the world? Because after all, wasn't that the ideal in this country? Wasn't that why immigrants came to America? Because it was the land of opportunity? Well, let's look at that, okay? Access to education. Education, evidently, for many people who look at income inequality, education is the key. That the argument goes, if more of the wealthy would allow those who are not, the middle and lower income areas, to go into school and graduate and get college degrees and then come out, that mobility within income will increase. It's no accident that I think there was a statistic that said that of all the elite schools in this country, only 8% of lower income students could actually enter. So there is a restriction, not only from this point of view, but from the cost point of view. As we all know, education has increased, the cost of education increases yearly. I think it's about 6 or 7% a year. So that there's really, different from my age, I could pay off my student debt in 2 or 3 years. Today, students are amassing anywhere from $50 to $100 to $150,000 in student debt, which stays with them year after year, decade after decade. So those costs are actually turning people away from higher education. Very recently, 2 weeks ago, I have a great buddy, and he asked me to go to his daughter's engagement party. I've traveled all over the world. Half of my life was in different countries investing in finance, and I've been to most of the emerging markets. Well, anyway, why the story? Because I went to the engagement party with my wife. We drove up to the house, or looking for the house, and what we found was this gated community with big walls and gates and a security guard. And I turned to my wife, I said, you know, this is very similar to what I saw in Johannesburg in South Africa back during the apartheid wars, where all the wealthy people lived in gated communities with security guards, and all the rest of the people suffered out there. And it struck me that in this country, I've been all over this country, and I'm starting to see this all over Texas, Florida, New York, even here. So it just is another sign, a worrying sign to me of where our society is going. And also what is happening in these gated communities and in these elite schools is that, and this is natural, that the wealthy's children are meeting the other wealthy children and spending less and less time out there in the world with the rest of us. And like in the Middle Ages in feudal societies, what is happening is that the wealthy are marrying the other wealthy, okay? And this is increasing, and so their society is getting tighter and tighter and leaving out the rest of us. Now, a lot of you out there would probably say, let's get the government involved. Let's redistribute this wealth, okay? Let the laws change. Now, I'm not so sure that that's the answer to this situation, okay? That tax the rich, tax the top 20%, take their money away and redistribute it to the rest of us, okay? It seems to be the answer, but it's too easy, and I'll tell you why. Because government is part of this problem. Did you know that in the D.C. District of Columbia, okay, which has got a Gini score equal to, I think it's Honduras, okay, but the problem is this, that 3 of the wealthiest counties in the United States, of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States, are all counties in Virginia and Maryland surrounding the capital. Now, how could that be? Well, what I found out in my research is that over the last 30 years, government spending, okay, as you know, and as we've been taught, has increased and increased and increased. But what you may not have known is 15 cents of every dollar that is collected and spent in government procurement stay in the D.C. area. That's right, it stays there, okay? Where the amount of population the D.C. area represents is less than 2% of the population, and yet 15 cents of every dollar stays there. And why? Why? It's because there has now become a new upper class of lobbyists and lawyers and procurement agents and corporations that all live in these counties around Washington, D.C., that have gotten to be extremely wealthy, okay, by the government spending. So I'm not so sure that I want to see, for example, that like in the Washington, D.C. area, that the top 5% of income earners earn 54 times the amount of money that the low income earners earn in Washington, D.C. So think about it. If we're going to go and tax the wealthy, whether it's higher income taxes or what, okay, and the government brings all that money in, is it going to be redistributed, or will it happen? And I believe it will. All that will mean is that, wow, we'll tax the rich, and then we'll get so many more dollars, of which 15 cents of every dollar will once again go into the DC area. Do I trust that the government is going to equitably redistribute that income to the middle class and lower middle class? No, I don't. I don't believe that, especially with the two-way street between corporate America and the politicians, okay? Now, what does that mean, okay? What that means for me is that, in fact, the politicians in this country are part of the problem, not part of the solution. You probably know that the average income of most of the politicians in this country is over $775,000 a year. Yep. So that automatically puts them in the 1%. Senators are, I think the average is between $1 and $2 million, okay? Once again, they're part of the 1%. Do I really believe that the Congress and Senate are going to legislate changes that will affect their own economic well-being? Maybe in a couple of instances they will, but for the most part, no. I do not believe this is going to happen. In fact, any kind of redistribution that we're talking about here will just probably make the matters even worse. So what's to be done here? Well, number one, we could try to return to actual capitalism if that's possible. But as I've said to you, the situation has changed globally. We can't control what happens in India or China or Vietnam or Spain, okay? They're on a roll of global capitalism, and in order for this country to compete, we too have to play the game of global capitalism. We could try in some shape or form to legislate the return of actual capitalism, and what do I mean by that? Well, we could provide incentives, okay, for banks to lend to small business people. I mean, I'm not talking about people that are just starting up and have some idea and no business plan and whatever, but people and corporations that are actually doing something, producing something, and could grow and hire more people at reasonable wages if they had more money borrowed from a financial institution. So maybe in some shape, way, or form, the government may have a role there in guaranteeing the loan or part of a loan to a bank that lends to an entrepreneur or a small or medium-sized business. Because after all, as we all know, small business is what creates the majority of jobs in this country. So, can we return financial markets to their original purposes? Please, please, we've got to. I mean, I work on Wall Street, and I'll tell you that that's a circus. I've been in this business for well over 35 years, and I will tell you that there has been an enormous change in how the financial markets are run and what they do on a day-to-day basis. I see more investment in Las Vegas than I do on Wall Street. So, could that be returned to the original purpose? Yes, Wall Street could turn if the incentives were there to force it to turn. Wall Street is all about money, okay? So if you offer enough money or an edge that others don't have, then yes, it could change. In other words, if you made it more lucrative to them to lend money or to take public a company than it is to buy futures on the gold COMEX exchange or to short Apple because of earnings next week, they would do it. You just have to make the incentives there. Can you establish a 21st century New Deal? Well, we might be able to, but it's what that New Deal would involve would be important. For example, if the New Deal involved higher wages built on infrastructure, it might work. What do we mean by that? Well, as you know, infrastructure, highways, bridges, those kinds of things in this country are crumbling, especially so when you compare it to the rest of the world. We've been saying this for years, we need a total remake on infrastructure in this country. Spending on infrastructure might be a reasonable New Deal if it provided reasonable jobs to reasonable Americans that could also, at the same time, teach them skills. There is a big unmatch in this country today between jobs available and labor. We've got an overabundance of labor, but it's unskilled labor, and we've got an overabundance of jobs that require skilled labor. And there's a big gap in between. It's a serious gap, and it has to be filled. There, maybe the government could provide a role, okay, in some shape or form. But that's not talking about free colleges. It's far more about on-the-job training and skills, the kind of things that unions used to be able to offer to their young members. Will that work? That's a question mark. In some ways, what I've seen in the past is whenever there's money spent in anything grand like an infrastructure situation, that so much of that money ends up going to unproductive means. If that were to occur, there would have to be a sort of New Deal in the way government actually dispenses the money. A watchguard committees, things like that, made up of maybe governments and private people at the same time. Would that work in today's society? I don't know, but it's necessary that if we are going to change this country, that has to occur. So, infrastructure might be an idea. And other ideas could be that with we could probably start to tax the capital gains, the non-W-2 income from the 1 or the 10 or the 15%. You know, the money they make from earnings and dividends that they pay capital gains on. More and more of the top income earners' income is coming from those sources and less from the money they actually make earning a living. So there is an argument that the government could and should tax those earnings and dividends at a higher rate. Now, the question then would become, how would you distribute that money to everyone else? And maybe the answer to that question is in things like health care or Medicare or Medicaid. In other words, taking that money, earmarking that money in order to contribute to those who need it most in certain already existent government programs, okay? And whether that would be Medicare or Medicaid, some kind of universal health care, something that might reduce some of the medical costs for the lower and middle income without really disincentivizing the really wealthy. But those are just suggestions. I'd like to come up with solutions, but this situation is even beyond me. It's going to take all of us and a lot more discussion, of which you consider this just the beginning. So for you, the best thing you could do is turn to your neighbors, sit down, and start discussing this, okay? And I know within us all, we've probably got the answers. It's just that we need to focus on this, and thanks.